This is Muhammad Faisal of Museum of Kashmir, and you're listening into our Sultanat podcast series. In this episode, we are going to discuss the role of Sufi masters in medieval Kashmir. We're going to discuss the governance, sectarian politics, and the Game of Thrones between Kashmir's king. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone. This is the episode 3 of Sultanat podcast, and today with us we have Dr. Zubair Khalid. He is a PhD from the Center of Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. His thesis is on state and polity under the Kashmiri Sultanate, which is what we have been discussing in the previous 2 episodes. He's interested in history, Kashmir, and Islam, and Sufism, and material networks and intellectual history of Kashmir. So we have been trying to chase this guy since January, and finally we have got him. He's cancelled twice, so third time, as we say in Kashmiri, Trem Go Wasta. So Zubair is here with us today, and we also have Shakir as always. Zubair, you're very much welcome to our podcast. Thank you for finally showing up.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Sorry for the earlier cancellations. I was actually not doing well, so that's why. Otherwise, I'm very much interested in this kind of stuff that things you're doing, and this is very encouraging for both the historians as well as the common people. So, yeah, thank you for having me.
So because of you canceled on us twice, we are going to have a very long podcast. So if you are
Sure.
feeling cold, you might get a kangar or a blower nearby.
That's already by my side, Kangri.
Okay. So let's just get the ball through rolling. Like, can you walk us through what the Sultanate period was like for like Kashmir? Like, if I was a Kashmiri during that time, what would the scene be like for me? Like, I previously, it was a very uh, Brahmanic or a Buddhist oriented, Sanskritic world. And then suddenly there is this shift into this Perso-Islamic country. So how would you as a person locate yourself in a time period like that?
So I think what we need to do in the first place is uh, I try to provide sort of the background to what I'm going to say, and this might be the longer part of my discussion, but I hope you bear with me on this, and because this is something that has an implication on the subsequent discussion also. So I think if you begin to think of the Sultanate period or the rule of a particular dynasty, there are some difficulties in how we understand that part of the that part of the history. The first and the biggest is, I would say, regarding the sources, because we don't have any extant sources from the first part of the Sultanate, that is from the 14th century. What we instead have is later day reflections on the period. So the earliest extant sources, one of them would be the 15th century Sanskrit chronicle of Jana Raja, who writes, as we know, during the period of Zainul Abidin in the mid 15th century. And this is almost a century after the Sultanate was established. And this is an important thing to remember. So the first century of the Sultanate rule, we have no historical account. The second problem is the available sources we have from the mid 15th century onwards are in Sanskrit. I mean, this is part of not a problem itself, but the earliest extant Persian works are available only 2 centuries later, from around the mid 16th century. So I use the word extant because we know that the Persian histories were written during the earlier phases of Sultanate rule. Some of them are quoted in the 16th century Persian texts, such as Tariq Said Ali, but their loss is all the more tragic because they were preserved till as late as the 19th century. So we learn from Hassan Shah Khuyami, for instance, that he uses some of these sources in his multi-volume Tariq Hassan. So what we are effectively left with now is that we don't have any accounts for the first century, and we have only Sanskrit accounts for the next century. And we are lucky enough to have, obviously, these Sanskrit works for what would otherwise have been a completely blank phase. but we would have preferred to have some Perso-Arabic interpretations of the time to go with Sanskrit histories. Now we of course have access to material sources of the time, such as mosques, khanqahs, and mazars, and other epigraphic and numismatic sources, which assume greater importance for the reasons mentioned above. But unfortunately, the tendency to interpret the material sources with reference to texts written centuries later has meant that the material culture of Sultanate era have been made to bear the burden, so to say, of testifying to modern day communal politics. And this is the general rule in modern historiography. Even as we have had recent works such as Samir Hamadani Saab's work, The Syncretic Tradition, which encourage us to have a fresh look at the material sources. So the problem at the first level is the absence or the scarcity or the lack of diversity or abuse of sources. And at the second level, the problem lies with the sources themselves. This is so because the sources, either the textual or the material, or within the textual, the Sanskrit or the Persian, were composed by people who had some stake in saying what they said about the past, present, or the larger categories of Sultanate era or the Kashmiri people and their past. In other words, there's no neutral or value free portrayal of these things in any of the sources we come across. And this is a very general issue and not exclusively applicable to sources on Kashmir history.
So
Uh,
basically,
now,
so basically,
Mhm,
to condense the whole thing that you just said is basically we don't have any reliable history on that period because one, we don't have for the first 100 years of the Sultanate period, we don't have a written history which is written on the same time,
true.
and also the history that is written after that even is basically has some certain bias of the individual or of that time itself. Is that what
Mhm.
we're trying to understand? So, but my question
Exactly.
here, Zubair bhai, is like
Mhm.
like when you know all of these biases and these sources that you have gathered, what
Mhm.
was the time like for an ordinary Kashmiri at that time to survive? For example, I was, thinking about like this guy walks into the Khanqa and he suddenly sees rows of people from different parts of the world coming together in that mosque because it was also a center of learning at that time. So for him, like, what was it like? Very much of a Persian influence. All of a sudden, his religion gets changed, he learns new
Mhm.
crafts at the same time. So can you like elucidate that picture for us?
True. The first thing I would like to point out is the bias we talked about is a very general thing. It's not something that's restricted to or specific about sources on Kashmir history. I mean, every history that has been written has some bias in it, has some point of saying what it says. So that this consideration should be there. It's not something applicable to Kashmir specifically. Now, when we talk about the actual question you asked, I would say we can. We have certain texts that we have, and uh, they, even if they do not tell us about the entire historical era, but they tell us about some things, so we can learn some of the things from them. And we have kind of, we can treat them as signposts, the texts we have. So for example, we have the earliest that we have is from Jana Raja, and Jana Raja is a Kashmiri Brahman. He's associated with Sultan Zainul Abidin. So I can say that for him, it meant one thing. It meant, for example, the Sultanate meant the establishment of peace. It meant the establishment of order. And but the time before Zainul Abidin's rule, it meant Kali Yuga, a bad phase in which Brahmins faced persecution. But the establishment of Sultan Zain's rule meant Satyug, a very good phase. And if we, for instance, accept the Islam as a liberating impact thesis, which I must mention has received a fair share of criticism, then I could say that this establishment of Sultanate gave impetus to socially marginalized groups for upward social mobility. For most of the Persian authors, I would say, who wrote in the second half of the 16th century, it meant the spread of Islam in tandem with change in political sphere and a proliferation of Sufi orders. For the likes of Nuruddin or Lalded, it meant new opportunities of learning, unlearning. and increased cross-cultural interactions. And at the same time, in the political realm, it meant many changes, but at the same time, many things remained the same. So we know that new modes and discourses of individual warriorship, or new forms of authority of kingship, such as the Sultan al-Adil, the ideal Islamic king, and the corresponding changes in titles, numismatics, they came in, and these were then added to the existing modes of kingship and political authority. And as such, we see that a Persianate or Islamicate and Sanskritic modes of kingship coexisted in Kashmir. So the ruler, for example, was portrayed as a divine figure ruling over a sacred landscape. And the Persian authors would obviously, they would attribute the sacrality to Islam and Sufism, but the troops of kingship, the troops of political authority, they remained the same. So,
Like, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean? The troops remained the same.
when we talk about, for instance, sacrality of the landscape, so it's an old trope that Kashmir is sacred land, right? And then we say that the ruler who rules over the sacred land is part of the divine himself. So this is something that's there in the Nilmat Purana, for instance. But when we come to Sanskrit texts, they will tell you the same thing. But for them, sacrality comes from Islam, it comes from Sufism. So, in this sense, the trope of sacrality remains, but it's obviously given a new definition by the Persian sources. So, and to a large extent, I would say is the framework that decides how we understand and organize individual facts. For example, if we take the framework of revolution that has mostly dominated the Sultanate historiography, we would note that people construct their narratives around things that have changed with the takeover of the sultans. So, Parmo, for instance, would argue that Sultanate marked the establishment of an Islamic state. And as a matter of fact, there are plenty of things that did change. But then the drawback would be that such works focus on change and not the things that remain the same. So if we take a longitudinary approach, for instance, and focus on structural aspects of the state, such as the revenue collecting machinery, the taxation, local administration, or the army, for instance, we would note that they were not revolutionary changes with the onset of the Muslim Sultan.
So basically, what you're saying is that everything remained the same, but at the same time, it didn't really remain the same in the details of it.
Exactly. That would be a good summary of it.
So with the immigrants coming into Kashmir, like how rapidly did things change, like in terms of like how the people wore clothes or how in terms of the governance itself, because the laws began to change. Because as far as I know, the Sharia law that uh, the law of the government wasn't first enforced by first Shahmiri kings, and then it was enforced by Sikandar and his son, and they used I believe they use Shafi code of law to to use in jurisprudence purposes. So how radical was that in terms of the governance part of it and also the local culture part of it?
See, I would say that immigration changed Kashmir immensely, and it changed Kashmir not so immensely. And before we go on to say things about what changed, we need to remember that immigration into Kashmir is as old as the history of the region itself. So we have, for instance, the Nilmat Purana, and it details the earliest patterns of immigration into Kashmir. So, if we take a look at the standard Sanskritic origin story of Kashmir, and we know the Kashyap Rishi, the quote unquote founder of Kashmir, is himself an immigrant who comes across the beautiful land and decides to settle in and drives away the ones who resided here. So, I would say immigration is intimately connected to the identity of the region. Now, when we talk about the Sultanate era immigrations, we need to remember that they represented a continuation of an older pattern rather than a novelty. And as far as the impact is concerned, it's pretty obvious that when we look at the socio-cultural, religious, economic, or political aspects, immigrants had already been playing a prominent role in shaping Kashmir. And this is something recent works such as those by Ashraf Wani Saab has sought to engage with. And there are others at the Central Asian Studies at Kashmir University. I remember the names of Ejaz Bande Sahab and Mamtaz Atu Sahab. They have been doing these kinds of work. And I think one of the reasons that Sultanate era immigrations have been framed in a particularly negative light is that they are seen as leading to religious and political change in Kashmir. One of the most frequently cited references for this argument is the passage from 15th century Sanskrit chronicle Shrivara, who says that uh, as the winds destroy the trees and the locusts, the shali crops, so did the Yavanas destroy the usage of Kashmir. This is a very famous quote from him. But then there are many things to consider here. What we often do is to conflate categories marking linguistic, ethnic, regional, social boundaries and club them all as references to a single group, Muslims in this case. So we assume that Shrivara is referring to Muslims and he has a problem with them. Then Shrivara is made to speak on behalf of all Brahmins of Kashmir, and then by extension, all Hindus of Kashmir, and then by extension, all non Muslims of Kashmir. And we trace our modern day religious tensions to Sultanate era. So while all of us agree that on the premise that Sultanate era immigrations brought in many changes, there's a subsequent division in how we understand these changes. So we say that they were good for Muslims, bad for Hindus, but I would say this is a problematic thing at many levels.
Why would you
First
say
is
that?
the
Why would you say that?
Mhm. Because if you analyze, for example, if you analyze Shrivar's statement, he's talking about the term, he used the term Yavana. So besides Yavana, he and other Sanskrit chroniclers, they use a number of other terms such as Mlech and they use Turushk. But we must remember that the use of these terms in Sanskrit texts, both in Kashmir as well as in the larger Sanskrit world, had meanings beyond religious identities and were used dominantly for those deemed as destroyers of social and moral order, irrespective of whether they were Hindus or Muslims or immigrants or natives. So we need to remember this. Then there were, of course, criterion of language, geography, Varna system, and notions of purity. But club all these terms as referring exclusively to immigrant Muslims is to oversimplify things, to say the least. And we may have our own individual parameters for distinguishing between good immigrants and bad immigrants. The Sanskrit authors had them, and the Persian authors had them as well. This is okay. I mean, John Raja might have had problems with some immigrant Muslims, or Shrivara might not have liked people converting to Islam, but they also tell us that Shahmir was blessed by Parvati to rule over Kashmir. And Sultan Zainal Abidin was an incarnation of Shiva. So rather than imposing our modern day binaries, we must pay attention to complexities and nuances of the way these texts talk about immigrants. Now, coming to the question more directly, I would say Kashmir changed a lot because, as we remember, the Sultanate was itself established by immigrants. Uh, as we know, both the Shahmiris and Chaks were recent immigrants into Kashmir. Then Islam, of course, I mean, starting right from Bulbul Shah to the Saids accompanying Syed Ali Hamadani or those who preceded or followed him, they had a big role in changing the religious landscape of Kashmir. And we also know that their interaction with local mystics was immensely productive. So we have figures like Lal Ded, Nuruddin, or even anti-mystic orders, right, like the Rishi Silsila taking on a new identity. So what we see is that new features of self-identity and regional identity, new forms of literature, and this is something people like Chitralekha Zucchi talk about. New connections emerge, new regions, new texts, new networks come within the reach of Kashmiris, and of course the Sufi networks, which built upon older networks of trade and diplomatic and political linkage, were the most prominent among these, and they led to emergence of a new material culture, new styles of dress, new foods, new architectural designs, with the help of immigrant artisans who were attracted by political patronage or traveled as part of Sufi networks. Uh, and this is something Samir Hamadani Saab has worked on. Uh, so we may have debates about the exact extent uh, or the exact measure of who did how much. For instance, we have a debate as to whether the Sayyids or the people like Sheikh Nuruddin should be credited for the religious transformation, or we have people complaining about the claims to certain privileged states by immigrant families and their access to resources, or people who link them to exploitation or usurpations in Sultanate Kashmir. This applies to the Baihaqi sites, for instance. They are very valid and genuine debates, and I think they should go on because they enrich our understanding of the past by adding new perspectives to it.
Like you mentioned about the immigrants, like if you look at the history at that point, Mir Syed Ali Hamadani sends his Sadats sometime before to prepare the ground. And there's because Bulbul Shah has already converted in Chana, and then there is this establishment of the Shahmir dynasty, and Mir Syed Ali Hamdani comes because he has been told, okay, now the grounds are ready for you to come. Uh,
Mm,
and we see how Mir Syed Ali Hamdani transforms Kashmir into an Islamicate a region. But at the same
mhm,
time, he has disagreements with Qutbuddin Shahmiri, if I'm correct, and who, when he writes Zakhiratul Mulk derived from other Islamic texts, he asks the Shahmiri king to like, let's follow this, and he famously says that this doesn't really apply to us right now. And there's
mm,
also the story of how Shah Hamdan left Kashmir and he passed away at Pakli and then he was buried at Khatlan. So there's this disagreement that Shah Hamdan has with the Shahmiri, and then comes his son, a 20-year-old, 21-year-old Mir Muhammad Hamdani. He comes to Kashmir and he stays for a longer period with Sikandar Shahmiri. And then he has a
mm.
very different dynamics, as also we discussed me and Shakir recently, that there was a previous guy who was the like like a guru kind of like a master to Sikandar, and how he feels threatened by this Mir Muhammad Hamdani coming in because he has obviously a lineage and he has a different understanding of things. So how did Sikandar Shahmiri trust this guy? And also Jonah Raja says that Sikandar goes every day in the morning to learn from Sikandar Shahmiri, from Mir Muhammad Hamdani. And also, just for everyone to understand, during this time, even in the Ottoman times or the Seljuk times, what used to happen is these Sufi masters or these religious scholars had their own kingship. They were called Khudavandigar. Basically, they used to be like the leaders of the society, while the king conducted the administrative and jurisprudence and security issues like a foreign policy. The societal understanding on how to conduct day-to-day lives and like judgments and everything was totally dependent on the religious scholars because they were given that autonomy. So how did this come up? Because one, his grandfather, his father has had a disagreement with Mir Syed Ali Hamdani, and now his son comes, and they are like always together. So what happens here?
See, when we talk about, for instance, Sayyid Ali Hamadani, I would say, um, he had different things for different people. Hamadani had different. I mean, for a trader, he had something. He had something. For a traveler, he had something. For the Sultan, he had something for the layman. So he comes up with Zakhirat al-Muluk, which, as you mentioned, detailed, rules of or ethics of personal conduct and political conduct as well. His Chihil Asrar, for instance, it deals with mystical themes. Then his Awrad Fathiya, it's a prayer for everyone. Then he writes Risala Itqadiya, it's on Islamic theology. He writes on Ibn Arabi's this Fusus al-Hikam, and then he has all these things to offer. Now, what he does in Kashmir is, before Kashmir, travel was an important part of their life. So we know that he traveled widely in the Persianate world. He travels to Azerbaijan, he travels to Khorasan, to Iraq, and he meets leading Sufi saints of his time. He meets Seminani, Alauddin Simnani. He meets Nishapuri, and it's then towards the end of his life that he comes to Kashmir. And in Kashmir, he meets the Sultan, other political leaders, local religious figures. And he certainly had his disagreements, as you mentioned, with Sultan Qutbuddin. But when we see his silsila, the Kubrawi silsila, it flourished after him, as you mentioned, between a result of association between Sultan Sikandar and Mir Muhammad Hamadani. And then we know that his works were carried on by his followers, who brought in his relics. Then his visitation to Kashmir is institutionalized in the form of a Khanka, the Khanka-i-Molla, and it assumes a very important role. And we also know that it was later in the 15th and 16th century, in that intra-Sufi and sectarian debates flared up, and his teachings are again invoked later on after he went away. So now, how were they linked to the political circles? I mean, we see that they were prolific scholars, so they had connections across political and religious boundaries. We have Hanglu's Ratanlal Hanglu Sab's work, for instance, which says that the connections of these personalities with the court, with the powerful elements, should be explained with reference to the legitimacy that they could endow on the rulers and their dynasties. The Sufi saints would also act as political mediators between who could negotiate, between warring groups or polities. And we know about this from details in Tariq Said Ali, for instance, which notes the explicit political roles played by Sufi saints, specifically the contemporaries or the predecessors of Syed Ali Hamadani. And we also know that Sufi networks could be used for collecting information. They were used as covert information gathering mechanisms. We know this from Tawfat al-Ahbab, which details how Iraqi was sent on a mission to kind of collect information about the potential invasion of a different king. So overall, I would say that the rulers needed the Sufis as much as the Sufis needed the rulers. And this is something not specifically applicable to Kashmir, but evident throughout the medieval history.
Okay, Zubair bhai, my next question is going to be, we talked about how these immigrants and how the governance operated. I wanted to ask, like, how important, like, what role did being in the government, like an Islamic government with the ruler being a Muslim, and then having these Sufi networks at in the establishment help or boost the numbers of Muslims in Kashmir? Like I remember Ashraf Ghani has a couple of theories that he analyzes. One is a liberalization theory that Islam came as a means of liberation from the previous structures, societal structures like the Brahmanical caste system. And then there's also this very famous theory about how Muslims in Kashmir converted because they were forced to. What was the dynamic of being in governance or being in the establishment, and how did that impact like the growth of Islam in Kashmir? Because by the end of the 15th or 16th century, almost 90% of Kashmir is Muslim.
True. So you were trying to ask about the role of the sultans or the political groups
Yes.
in propagation of the religion.
Yes.
Well, they had an important role. They certainly played a very important role, because we see that, for instance, if we see Sufis as the main agents of Islamization, as and there won't be many disagreements about this. But we need to look at the fact that the Sufis were patronized by the rulers. So that's an important thing to remember. Then we also see that structures that represented kind of the proliferation, the bringing in of Islam, such as the khanqahs, the mosque, they had directly to do with the political leaders, the sultans, or other groups in the political establishment. But at the same time, we need to, if we kind of take a look at the bottom-up approach, so that's wherein people like Sheikh Nuruddin, who did not have many political connections, come in, and we can note that Islamization was not exclusively, it was not exclusively linked to political groups, and there were agents who did not have any political role, who did not have political connections. They played an important role as well. So I would say, it's kind of debatable. It's kind of so it depends on the perspective you choose in, and yes.
Okay, now there's a lot of orders, Sufi orders coming in Kashmir from the Kubravis. Then there is also the Sohrawardi order coming, which is led by Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom. So haven't really discussed him in our Sultanate period, but he is one of the more remarkable figures when it comes to that part of the time. So what did Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom, what was his role in the overall Sultanate era politics? Because he led a religious mission. And can you also talk about how he brought the Rishi order into the Sohrawardi order, and why did he do that?
Uh, See, I think the role of Sheikh Hamza needs to be kind of contextualized in the 16th century. When you talk about his political role, his religious role, as you mentioned, is pretty much well known. But if you talk about his political role, then we need to, add a bit of context to that. And we need to remember that Sufi saints had already played very prominent political roles. This is true of, to some extent, of Syed Ali Hamadani, but this is more applicable to Syed Muhammad Hamadani. And then we had the, excuse me, then we had the Nur Bakhsh Saint Shamsuddin Araki, whose role was even more pronounced. In a sense, the 16th century itself defined his political role, because politics and religion at that time when he came up were intimately connected. And it's very clearly evident in Shamsuddin Araki, who had taken up a political role in the political circles of 16th century Kashmir and emerged as the patron saint kind of the emerging faces of Chak, such as Kaji Chak, or prior to him, other powerful people like Musa Rena. So now, if we come to the political role of Sheikh Hamza, I would first underline the difficulties in analyzing this, because while we might assume that Sheikh Hamza played a massive political role, which the later sources may credit him with, I would say that it's a rather difficult task to exactly evaluate the actual impact. One reason for this is that the sources we primarily rely on for constructing narratives of this kind, that's the contemporary 16th century sources, do not tell us much about it. But this is, of course, excluding the hagiographies that were compiled by his disciples. Now, if we check his disciple Baba Daud Khaki's Wirdul Muridin, for instance, or Dastur Salikin, which he later wrote as a commentary of it, we learn that Sheikh Hamza preferred to stay away from political circles. But while we know that the Sohrawardiya did not probably kind of submerge themselves in politics as much as the Naqshbandiya did, we also know that they were not completely averse to politics. So Khaki's Dastur, for instance, recounts the merits of a just ruler, the Sultan al-Adil. but he tells us that Sheikh Hamza stayed away from the Chaks, and I think this was in itself a political act because it had the potential to deprive the Chaks of the popular legitimacy. And this is something Khaki elaborated upon as a discourse in his Dastur.
My
So,
question, to elucidate why was this rivalry between Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom on the one side and and Shamsuddin Iraqi on the other, is the fact that Shamsuddin Iraqi was a Nurbak Shia who comes from Iran, and as Satori writes in his introduction of he was here sent as an emissary of the Nurbak Shia order into Kashmir, which kind of
mm,
is the it goes towards the Shia part of Islam, while as Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom was the leader of the Sunni Islam, which was a uh, dominant sect in Kashmir at that time. And then the Shamsin Iraqi increases his numbers later on, and also the Shahmiris are weakened because of after the death of Zainul Abidin, his successors weren't able to control the kingdom, and there was this Game of Thrones happening between his sons, and
mm,
which only helped boost the power of the Chak nobles inside the Shahmiri, and then they became the kings, and because they were partnered by Shamsin Iraqi, he
mm.
became the dominant force. And while he's the dominant force, the majority of Muslims are still Sunni, and there is this civil war that is happening. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So, as I just mentioned, Iraqi had preceded, and we all know this, Iraqi had preceded Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom, and as the head of the Noor Bakshe sect. But we also know that the Noor Bakshe sect itself had kind of, there was a split after Muhammad Noor Baksh, the founder of the Noor Bakshe sect, had declared himself the Mahdi. So there might have been an intra-Kubrawe competition as well in the first place. We know this because Sheikh Fathullah, for instance, who was the son of Sheikh Ismail, and Sheikh Ismail was one of the prominent Kubrawi Sufi saints. So we see that Sheikh Ismail is a Kubrawi Sufi saint. His son Sheikh Fathullah is known as one of the teachers of Sheikh Hamza. So it becomes kind of Shia versus Sunni. But we could read Sheikh Ismail versus Iraqi also as Shia versus Sunni, and in that case we could trace the sectarian competition under Duglat to the beginning of the 16th century itself, and that's pretty much before Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom came on the scene. And we also know that the Kubrawi identity itself is a matter of debate. We have different views about their Shia or Sunni tendencies, and that these views can in turn be traced to variant readings of Jafar Badakhshi's Khulasatul Manaqib, and then on the other hand, we have Haidar Badakhshi's Manqabat al Jawahir, and so we also have examples cited earlier of Sheikh Shihab versus Shamsuddin Iraqi, and they have debates about Muawiyah, for instance. So, and these things are mentioned in Tuhfat al-Ahbab, because so when we talk about Sheikh Hamza, we see that he had inherited a past in which sectarian competition had already taken root. But
Just 1 second for our listeners. What Professor Zubair is saying is that Shamsuddin Iraqi and Mir Syed Ali Hamdani come from the same sect, Sufi order called the Kubravis, which later had a Shia part as well, from which time Shamsuddin Iraqi emerges. So he's basically saying that it kind of branched out into various, it became a little more diverse than what it was originally after one of the Kubrawi leaders called himself the Mahdi, and then it
mm,
comes to Kashmir. So just
true, true.
for a little understanding, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so what I was trying to explain is that the Kubrawiya, as we know, for instance, at the time of Syed Ali Hamadani, At the time, it was there was a single Kobraviya branch. We mainly know it as the Kobraviya Hamadani branch, but we know that when this Muhammad Nur Baksh proclaimed himself as the Mahdi, there was one group which contested his claim. So there was a split in the Kobraviya sect, and one branch of it was led by this Muhammad Nur Baksh. And it is Shamsuddin Araki is the disciple of Muhammad Nur Baksh's son, whose name was Qasim Faiz Baksh. So the Kobraviya had already split before Shamsuddin Araki came to Kashmir. And this is the context of the competition, the intra-Kobravi competition, for example, between the leaders of the Kobravi branch, such as Sheikh Ismail on the one hand, and then Araki on the other hand. So we see Araki is trying to appropriate, once Araki comes to Kashmir, he's trying to appropriate the Kobravi past. But that's not an easy task, because the split has already happened, and there's another group of Kobravis which lays claim to being the original Kobravis. So there's competition over Khanka Mualla, for instance. And this is the context which explains why Shamsuddin Araki had to build a new Khanka for himself, which was located, as we know, which was located in Zadibal. So these things are there, yes.
So, what was Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom's overall response? Because one, he doesn't have the power that the previous Sufi saints had over the kingdom, because now he has a rival in Shamsin Araki, who once he returns back has more power because of the Chak. So, and there's also this, I don't know if this is true or if this based on evidence, that Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom itself, he was exiled from Srinagar, as far as I understand. I don't know if that's true or not. So how did he navigate that time? Because he passes away before the Chak rule ends, and there's also this incident of Qazi Musa Shaheed. Like, can you like talk
Mhm.
about that as well? That would be great, because we can from that incident we can understand what the situation was like. Because there's also this glamorization of Chucks because of recent nationalist politics, that they were the last kings and everything. But there's also a lot of things that happened during their rule in Kashmir as well. There was a big civil war or a sectarian strife in itself. So can you like talk about that? Thank you.
See, if you talk about the role of Sheikh Hamza, I'll illustrate this with example of Baba Daud, what Baba Daud Khaki says, because Khaki is his most prolific um, successor, and then he's a very well-known author. He's very influential member among his followers. So if you look at Dastur, for instance, or later works which Khaki wrote for the Chak ruler Yusuf Shah, such as Kaside Gusliya, it becomes very clear that he tried to engage with the Chaks at many levels. And we also know mainly from later historians that the relationship between Ghazi Chak and Sheikh Hamza, something you pointed out just now, it was strained, to say the least, uh, after Ghazi Chak took over the government in 1554. And this is exactly the time when Khaki is writing his Dastur. So some argue that Ghazi Chak may not have been as involved in the sectarian project as his predecessor Kaji Chak, for instance. But we know that sectarian tensions were there in Srinagar, as is evident, for instance, in the execution of two prominent Hanafi ulama in the infamous case during the reign of Ghazi Chak's successor, Hussain Shah Chak. So it's a rather tough time for Sheikh Hamza and his followers. Now, what Khaki does in this situation is that he engages with the Chaks, as I said, at many levels. For instance, he severely criticizes one section of the Shia, whom he calls the Rawafid. But then he tells us that the Shia, all Shia are not Rawafid. He goes on to say that Shia and Sunni are one, in the famous phrase, Shia was Sunni yaki hastand. But then he goes on to further classify the Shia and says, Amma Ahli Rafd. so whom he terms as separate from the mainstream Shia thought, and defines them as the ones who speak bad of the companions of the Prophet. And later on in his Qasida Ghusliya, he seeks to portray Sultan Yusuf Shah as the friend of the Prophet and his family and his companions. So he says, Doost Dar Mustafa wa Ahle Bayt wa Sahab, and approves his faith as a righteous creed. So he's offering kind of the terms of a potential reconciliation and clarifying his position, which was the position of Sheikh Hamza and the Soharwardiya at large. What he also does is that he redefines his peer as the de facto authority in religious and worldly affairs. So he bestows upon him titles of Ul al Amr and then Sultan and Khalifa, and we know that these titles were dominantly used for describing political authorities. What this implies is that following a saint rather than a political authority was the prerequisite of a correct faith and practice. And we should remember that this was happening at a very critical time when the Chaks were coming in as independent rulers and the Mughals were constantly interested in Kashmir. So Khaki's work could be read as offering kind of the terms of a sectarian and political reconciliation by clarifying his position on certain contentious issues. And this was the position of Sheikh Hamza as well, even as as you mentioned, Sheikh Hamza passed away pretty much before the Mughal overtake of Kashmir.
There's another Khalifa of Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom, Sheikh Yaqub Sarafi, who, you know, becomes very prominent after he goes to Makkah and studies there and returns home. He's also, because he has also these networks with the Sufi masters in Delhi, he is like, as far as I understand, he also convinced the Mughals about what was happening in Kashmir. But before all of that, there is also this Kazakh, one of the greatest Kazakh poets who happens to have been assassinated in Kashmir, Mirza Haidar Duglat, who, as a governor of Humayun, comes to Kashmir. So I fail to understand, how did he have such a big impact while the Chucks were also running the affairs? Was this like a parallel kingdoms at the same time? Like Bush's Razi Kırlı per Nava Kırlıs per rule Karabaki Goitse, is that, how was the situation at that time?
See, partly this is what was the case, because initially we see that Duglat comes in as a raider in 1533, but later on when he comes as the representative of the Mughal ruler Humayun, what he does is that he does not replace the entire machinery. And we also know that he had people such as Abdal Magre and another group of nobles from Kashmir who supported him against the Chaks, against the
And
Kaji Chak.
and also to know, he was a very staunch Sunni, and there's also a lot of literature written how he really did not like Shias in Kashmir, and he deemed them as infidels. And there's a story of how he exhumed Shamsin Araki's body and demolished his Imambara, his Khanka in Zadibal, and then it was replaced and it went to Badgam. So he was also very extreme in his approach towards the Shias, or he wanted the Sunnis to reaffirm their political power, because in Delhi under Humayun and later under Akbar and everyone else, later on with every else, it was primarily a Sunni kingdom. So just painting a scene of Mirza Haider was. Also, he's one of the greatest Kazakh poets. He's like the Tagore of that country. Oh yeah, let's go. He is in Kashmir as a raider now. After Humayun defeats Sher Shah Suri, he becomes like the governor of Kashmir, but he doesn't really replace the Chak authority. But he still somehow symbiotically survives within Kashmir. So what happens later?
See, as you the thing you talked about his anti-Shia stance, I would like to add to that, and even this even applies to his anti-Chak stance. So when he comes in, and there's a very detailed description of it in I think it's in Baharistani Shahi. He comes in, he takes Chak leader Regi Chak with him, and he goes to the tomb of Shamsuddin Araki at Zadibal. He pays due respects there. He prays Fatiha there, and he leaves. So, this is to qualify his image of a Shia hater. So we need to contextualize what he did. I think it had more to do with the political stance of the Noor Bakshia and the Chaks, rather than entirely based on faith. We can
So,
always argue.
can you explain
Mhm.
that a little?
Yes,
Like,
as I just pointed out, when he first visits Kashmir, he takes Chaks with him, and he visits Shamsuddin Araki's grave. He pays respects there, and Baharistan has a very detailed description of the respectful conduct, I would say, that he does at the shrine of Shamsuddin Araki. But later on, when he realizes that the Chaks and the Noor Bakshia is it's a kind of a combine against which is working against him. He takes on very repressive measures against the Noor Bakshia Chak combination. And then there's another thing, when we talk about he criticizes the Noor Bakshiyas. He says that I have checked with the ulama of the Hind and with other ulama, all of the Mughal ulama. They say that they say that this is not the Noor Bakshiya is not something that you should take seriously. It's nowhere there, in the creed. But this had itself some grounding because, as I mentioned earlier, the Noor Bakshiya were actually criticized for their faith, and then the section of Kubravis that had contested Muhammad Noor Baksh's claim. It itself, so there were problems within the Kubravis. There was one branch that considered Muhammad Noor Baksh not as a Mahdi but as a Sufi saint. But what Shamsuddin Araki does here is that he portrays Muhammad Noor Baksh as a Mahdi. So this is something that's contested not just by the Sunnis, not just by one section of the Kubrawiya, but also by one section of the followers of Muhammad Noor Baksh himself. So there's a certain context to what this Duglat says about the faith of the Noor Baksh. He says that they're imposters, that it should be banned. This faith, it doesn't exist anywhere. These were debates that were already happening there, and Duglat was not the one to invent these things. These things had already been said, and as Shehzad Bashir points out, Muhammad Noor Baksh, for many people and many of his followers, was a Sufi saint, a plain Sufi saint, nothing more than that.
but Satoshi
Yes.
also says that when he arrived in Kashmir, he deemed himself to be the successor of Shah Hamdan. But once he's
True,
recalled back, he's asked to pursue that mission. He takes on a more active Nur Bakhshia role.
true, that's true, that's true. That's true. That's what I'm saying. He's trying to appropriate one part of the Kubrawiya. But we should
Okay.
remember that one part. And there are many other things which the Kubrawiyas, which the followers of Muhammad Nur Baksh himself say. And this is one part of that this Shamsuddin Araki is saying. There are
So
others who are contesting it from within the tradition. Yes.
so now Mirza Haider is obviously like actively engaging in war with the Chucks with the help of Margraves as well. Uh,
Mhm.
and he is killed in Patan, I believe. While he's or Tral or Patan, he's shot. Some say friendly fire, some say he was killed by the opposing Chak party. So then Chak again remain in power. But there's also this Game of Thrones that the Shahmiris went through in their own time. The Chucks also go through the same thing. One day, one cousin is the ruler. The second day, someone else is ruling the. And coming to Yusuf Shah Chak itself, he's a lot romanticized thanks to Haba Khatun's literature and the one moon and the songs and everything. Do you think
Mhm.
he is what he is portrayed as, or was he a weak ruler who also fomented conflict in Kashmir? Because Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom says that he, or Baba Dawood Khaki says that he is he's a lover of the Prophet and the Ahl Sunnah and Ahl Bayt. But at the same
Mhm.
time, he is not really powerful enough. So he seeks support from the Mughals and does that make him a weak person? Because I mean, I don't think anyone could have survived the Mughal onslaught, regardless of who was in power in Kashmir. Because Sikandar himself, who was very powerful at that time, he also so accepted being a vassal of the Timurids in his time. Is that a correct understanding of the situation?
See, first, I would like to briefly talk about. You mentioned about the Game of Thrones. It was. I'd like to add that it was a very natural, part of the politics at that time. If you look at the Delhi Sultanate, for instance, similar things are happening there. Immigrants are coming in. They are establishing dynasties. We have Turks. We have Khalids. Then we have Lodhis from Afghanistan. So all these kinds of things are happening in the Persianate world at large, and Kashmir is not an exceptionally bad place to be. No, I'm just trying to add the context. And now, when we come to Yusuf Shah, he's obviously romanticized, but it has some obvious reasons. For instance, if we look back at the 16th century, we know that it was a time when Kashmir was independent, or at least it was ruled by a dynasty that was centered within Kashmir. It had a capital. It was not located somewhere else. It was within Kashmir. And in an era of hyper nationalism, this is a very huge thing for a modern reader. This is part one. Then there's another part to his romanticization, which concerns the personality of Yusuf Shah. I mean, he's remembered as romantic who roamed meadows and mountains, and then the Haba Khatun part, he flirted with Haba Khatun, he loved arts and music. And then there's another part to his romanticization is the tragedy that he went through. I mean, a romantic tragedy is always a very popular plot. Yusuf Shah, as we know, ends up losing Haba Khatun, he loses his kingdom, he loses his freedom, and so his life is a perfect recipe for a remembrance. Now, the was he a weak ruler? I mean, he won the first war against his uncle Abdal Chak, but soon lost to Sayyid Mubarak Baihaqi, who had other Chak nobles on his side. But then Lohar Chak overthrows Baihaqi, and I suppose much of the censure that Yusuf Shah faces is because, as you mentioned, after his initial fight, he went to Fatehpur Sikri and submitted to Akbar. Then he asks for his help in restoring him to his throne in Kashmir. So, the censure comes from the fact that rather than fighting on his own, he makes Mughals a party to conflict in Kashmir. Now, this is a problem because many modern historians would see this as a pivotal moment that prepared the way for the eventual subjugation of Kashmir 6 years later in 1586. But I would like to add two things in order to add some context to what he did. I mean, things are obviously debatable and the debates won't settle, but just to add some context, first is the obvious fact that this was not the first Mughal intervention in Kashmir. As we already talked about, nor
Mirza
was this
Haider.
the Mirza Haider, true. Mirza Haider, even before that, Mirza Kamran comes in 1526. And then even prior to that, we have Taimur. Even prior to that, we have Mongols. So there's a lot of history behind it. Now, this was also not the first time that a Kashmiri ruler or a noble had sought foreign help. I mean, Kaji Chak sought the help of Sher Shah Suri against Haider Duglat in 1540, or Duglat himself was invited by Kashmiri nobles to fight against Kaji Chak. Then Sultan Zainul Abidin, we have this image of a very strong ruler. He himself went to the ruler of Punjab and sought help against his enemies in the very initial phase of his rule. But again, I suppose Yusuf Shah Chak's outreach to Akbar is seen as an act of submission rather than an alliance. And this has to be understood with reference to the perception of Mughals as a dominant and intimidating force rather than as equal allies. Then another reason for vilifying Yusuf Shah could be what followed after his submission to Akbar. This is the eventual Mughal overtake in Kashmir. But then this event, or at least the way it has been talked about in later historiography, also needs to be examined. There's a very recent article by my friend Shakirul Hassan. He's in DU currently, and he notes that the Mughal conquest needs to be understood as a quote unquote phased opening rather than a singular watershed event. Because even prior to 1587, Mughals constantly engaged in patronage, diplomacy, and a steady breach of Kashmir's borders. So, in that sense, Yusuf Shah's rule and submission marks one of the many events rather than the decisive event. And what was more important is that after the conquest, uh, the Mughal rule established themselves by comprehensively engaging with local landed and religious elites, even as other sections are singled out for persecution. So rather than a single picture of Yusuf Shah as a weak romantic or a pragmatic ruler, or the 1915 19 sorry 1586 87 events as conquest or resistance, new paradigms of evaluating the past keep on evolving, and they redefine the way we look at these events. Yes.
So you're basically saying that it was a norm to seek help, and also, like,
Yes.
I think GMD Sufi writes in his amazing book Kashmir in 1945. I think he writes that when Yusuf Shah goes to the tent, Akbar like kind of like tells him like, dude, I gave you the like that. Well, we had an agreement in place. Like, why are you ditching me now? And then he takes him to Delhi, and then Yaqub Shah Chak comes to Delhi, and then he's asked to perform a task to kill a Rajput king, and he like decapitates his head. And then there is this
Mhm.
war in Kashmir, and there's two. Twice the Mughals come. Once they are defeated by the chieftains in Badarwa, the Magres, and the Pares. But at the
True.
same time, the GMD Sufi also portrays Yusra Chak's picture as he was not really like put in the prison like a solitary confinement. He was not like that. He was part of the
Mhm.
Mughal court, and in fact, he says that in one famous incident that he objected to a musician in the court, like he told him like your meters are off, tumhare sur nahi lag rahe, and this is how he sang. And then he was also
Mhm.
given a jagir in Bihar later on, where he also remarried apparently.
True, true. That's true. He was not allowed to come back to Kashmir. That's it. I mean, he
Okay.
was not a literally he was not a prisoner in the sense that he was confined to a prison, but it's that he was not allowed to come back to Kashmir,
Hmm.
and he was instead sent to Bihar. True.
Okay.
That's
Apparently, he also fought battles for the Mughals, as far as I remember.
Mhm.
But I don't know if how much of that is true. But let's move on to the next part. Is okay, the Mughals are coming. So there's this important thing I wanted to ask. There's a lot of this historical reference or theory that it was the Kashmiri Sufis, a delegation of Yaqub Shah Sarfi, Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom, who actually had passed away in the 70s. They had
Mhm.
gone to the Mughals and asked them to invade Kashmir, and it
Mhm.
also is there's also a lot of references to that in our history.
Mhm.
As far as I know, reading Rafiqi's amazing book on Sufism in Kashmir, he says that it was only Yaqub Shah Sarfi who was part of the Mughal delegation when they invaded Kashmir. Like, and also there's no actual document of what they are saying. Ki Mosul Timan letter, like they had sent the Mughals a letter to invade Kashmir. So can we like
Mhm.
talk about that?
See, there are many versions of it. I mean, one version is that there was a sort of a collective this was a kind of a collective action by Kashmiris who were against the Chak rule. They were against the Shias, and then the Soharwardis and other Sunni Sufis, they went on with the mission to invite Akbar. But as you mentioned, there are not many textual or documentary evidences, except for instance, we know from Baharistan Shahi that Yaqub Sarfi was there with the imperial Mughal officers which came in. But I don't think there are many things we can discuss on this, because the documentary, the textual evidences do not support many of these views.
I think we covered
But there was
everything.
certainly, I mean, they did
I think
certain
we
sections did play a
I
role.
think he spoke very
For
well about
instance,
a
as you
lot of
mentioned
things
about
about the
Yaqub
start of the
Sarfi,
Sultanate
we have a
period,
reference to him that
about the
he
ingress,
was with
the
the
encounter that
army. He
Kashmir
was,
had with the
kind
Muslim,
of guiding
uh,
them,
you
and
know,
he
cultural
visited the
sphere
court.
that was
He
there on
visited
its
Akbar.
western side,
These
and
references
then
are there
also
in,
about the
I think it's in Bahar
Mir Syed
Shari.
Ali
That's true.
Hamadani as and his how he came to Kashmir and what the kind of big event that he had in Kashmir, and sort of catalyzed a cycle of changes with which resulted in the sort of gradual what we call as a coloration of Islamic culture and other material aspects associated with the Islamic civilizations began to grow and amass and sort of pervade, you know, pervade through the cultural milieu of cultural, religious, and other forms of milieu in Kashmir. And then we go on to the second phase, which is the Rishi order, which partly began as a, in some interpretations, we could say it began as a sort of a movement against the original the Central Asian immigrants that were there in Kashmir. And Rishi order, we had this vernacularization of Islam. We had this local elements as well as the elements that were brought from outside. They were synthesized together, and we had a new kind of indigenous order that swept through Kashmir, followed by Zubair's very, very brilliant summary about how the other Sufi orders, the kind of role that Sufi orders had to play as how emissaries would use that to, we know about Shamsuddin Iraqi, he coming to Kashmir and sort of starting his own Nur Bakshi order, and then the Suharwardi order, which was already there, which is the indigenous expression and sort of represented, went into having a sort of a antagonistic relationship with the Nur Bakshiyas. And then how foreign, because the centralized state that Budshah, that Zainul Abidin Budshah had built, it sort of it went on to disintegrate, it went on to weaken because of the successive wars that his sons and grandsons were indulging, and then which made Kashmir sort of a ground, it made Kashmir vulnerable to foreign invasions. We had starting with Kamran Mirza from west, and then others, and then Mirza Haider is succeeding in one invasion. It's incomplete. He has to leave, and then he comes again upon the invitation of the local Kashmiri, mostly the Sunni community. And then he sort of to because the rebellions against him are recurrent. They are recurrent. They are one after another, led mostly by Chucks, who were mostly, although not invariably, the Nurbakshias themselves. This led to Mirza Haider to impose the Sunni religion very, very authoritative, in a very authoritarian way, which led to the outlawing of the Nurbakshia order. And then the Mirza Haider himself, actually, of course, he dies because of the rebellion, because he starts striking coins in the name of Humayun, which probably Kashmiris do not sort of agree to. I mean, it is seen as a very significant breach, because until then, Mirza Haider was just played a very, even if he was a de facto ruler, he was still a governor, whereas the titular, more nominal role was played by the Nazuk Shah, who was the Shahmirid king. So probably Kashmir. It shows that how much Kashmiris had allowed their sovereignty at the first place, which even then they rebelled against Mirza Haider, which led to his killing, followed by the other events which Zubair walked us through in a very sort of a detailed way, in ways we hadn't previously known, or we couldn't have sort of made on our own, even if we access the primary sources. That's why it's very important to have a guide, to have an expert in the field, which Dr. Zubair is. And then we eventually come to know about the Yusuf Shah Chak, the kind of chaotic circumstances that led to Mughal invasion of Kashmir, because Mughals already, anyway, we could not have no matter how much we try to sort of show the situation in Kashmir was chaotic, we already know from the other Mughal historians, who have written about extensively about the Timurid Empire, the Indo-Islamic Timurid Empire of India, which is the Mughals, that during the reigns of Babur and Humayun, they weren't being very expansionist, because they were sort of busy with consolidating the empire. It's only during the Akbar's rule that Mughal empire actually expanded beyond precedent. So it was likely that whether or not Kashmir had those circumstances, Akbar still would have found a pretext.
to invade Kashmir anyway, and he found that in the kind of sectarian, that is being sort of projected as a pretext that Akbar got in the sectarian struggles of Kashmir at that time. He would have anyway invaded Kashmir and found it, because he it was a territory that they had always loved, and it was like their summertime retreats were done in Kashmir. Every Mughal emperor is said to have visited Kashmir. Jahangir had a very special love for Kashmir. So did his sons, grandsons. This guy in particular called Darashiko, who had built a very magnificent places, Pari Mahal and other mosques like Mullah Shah Mosque. And then the idea that Kashmiris had some role to play in inviting the Mughals to come to Kashmir is also a bit problematic because it's not explained in the earlier sources. It's only in the 19th, 18th, and 19th century sources that we come to these scraps that Kashmiris were involved. So it seems like a bit revisionist. I mean, there's the information that we have is not very reliable.
I think it also lacks context, like Zubair
It also
said
lacks
beautifully.
context, yeah.
Yeah, because if you understand the context, you don't really see it as an invitation. You see as, okay, we need to fix things, and it was a tradition of that time. So two things I gathered from Zubair Bhai's, I mean, like it's so comprehensive. It should be taught in universities. Is Mirza Haidar's situation at that time is akin to what Umar Abdullah is going through. The Chaks went through the same because they really did not have any power, and the and also and let's talk about the next question, which is basically, so Mughals have entered Kashmir. So did the strife end, Zubair sir? And also,
Well,
how true is that there were rebellions? Was the rule popular? And we also know there's also this another historical, I would say, inaccuracy where we paint the Mughal rule as a monolith, that they were all cruel to Kashmiris, but obviously there's a lot of context to that as well. So just a brief answer: Mughals have entered Kashmir. Does the civil
mm,
strife end? And were there rebellions? And how was the Mughal rule? Like, was it bad, completely bad, or was it like, okay? I mean, things were better and could have been more better.
well, I would say it depends on who you ask, because for some, yes, it was a great time. Civil strife ended. For others, no. So to begin with, if you look at how the Mughals themselves portrayed it, for instance, we have the account of Abul Fazl, for instance, and for him, the establishment of Mughal rule meant a stark contrast with the Chak past, and he describes the Chak past as based on bigotry, ta'assub. So for him, the Mughal rule meant the establishment of Akbar's policy of Sulhikul, the perfect and universal rule of peace. Similarly, we have another chronicler, Sanskrit chronicler Shuka. So for him, the establishment of Mughal rule meant the return of Dharma and a restoration of an ideal Sanskritic political order in which the Brahmins did not have to pay taxes or face discrimination. Now we know that these descriptions are in stark contrast to how the author of Baharistan Shahi, for instance, portrays the coming in of Mughals. And we also know that the Baharistan Shahi is seen as an expression of spirit of freedom and patriotism in pre-Mughal Kashmir. So we see that Baharistan notes that some Kashmiri nobles were completely wiped out. It also criticizes the functioning of the Mughal administrative machinery. It alleges that the Mughals harassed the people, they oppressed the people by excessive taxation. So, it really, as I said in the beginning, it really depends on who you ask. For different people, it meant different things. Now, regarding the second part, yes, there were rebellions in Srinagar, and the Mughal commander Qasim Khan and even Yaqub Shah, Chak had to win over the powerful nobles who kept on, changing their alliances. And I would say that's where Yaqub Shah lost. The rebellions against the Mughals, however, continued even after that. Hmm. Yes.
Okay. I mean, this is super comprehensive. I really like this is one of my favorite podcasts that I have done ever. There's also this theory, like the last question that I have. No, there's another question after this, which will be a shorter one. So this question basically is there's also this narrative mansa Kashmir Purchasana Pogo Mughal, the Shikas Mughal. It's like a invective that Kashmiris had around the Mughal rulers itself. And also that this narrative that is being projected that Kashmiris literally fought the Mughals with stones. And I read Muhammad Hassan's book where he says using stone throwing was part of a Kashmiri warfare under the Chaks for a certain time. So how true is that?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I don't have any details on factual details on this, but I would say yes, a certain section of people they did resist, and then we remember in modern times their resistance as you know as expression of love towards the land of Kashmir, the nation of Kashmir, the people of Kashmir. But I think what we need to do is to use the parameters and yeah that those people had in those times, rather than impose our own understanding, our modern conceptions on a time that has gone past, so as to understand better the how the events went on and who did what. So I think this could be a very modern way of putting it, that we had resistance against a foreign invader. Yes.
Okay. Now we have ended the podcast. I have a question that I ask a lot of people. From the
Mm.
Sultanate period, rank the top five most influential people and give us like a couple of reasons why do you think so?
Well, to be honest, I think this is the most difficult one of all the questions we had so far, because there are so many, so many great people throughout, and this is such a long period of time. But still, I would say, for instance, we can begin with the Bulbul Shah,
Like
because
where do
he
you rank him? And five, four. And this doesn't have to be historical accurate. I know like you're an academic, but we can do it like a fun way. So number five is Bulbul Shah.
number five would be Bulbul Shah, because he is the one we know of who converted Rinchen Shah and others, and then so he's the one who is credited with uh, beginning of Islam in the region. And then number two would be
Number four.
number four would be uh, Syed Ali Hamadani, I would say, because he opened up Kashmir to a new world of Sufi networks. And then number
Three.
three would be uh, Sultan Zainul Abidin, I guess, for doing what he did. We all know him as Budshah. So obviously,
Well,
I
I
don't think.
wonder what the number one and two, because you took two names that I think should be in the top three, but let's see what number two we have.
Well, number two, actually, I would like to take the liberty of having two people because
Okay.
Shamsuddin, Shamsuddin Araki and Sheikh Hamza, because they, I believe, had immense role in shaping the religious milieu of 16th century, not only 16th century Kashmir, but also what we currently are now. And the number one person
Wait,
I
wait,
would
wait. For number two, Shamsuddin Araki and Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom are still in rivalry. So let's go to number one.
rivals, but yeah, the number one for me would be Sheikh Nuruddin, because, and I know this is obviously debatable, but for me, he would be number one because of the impact he had on masses and the popular appeal he generated among the common people. And I know this is debatable, but still, I would go with him as number one.
What if I tell you that the Rishi order was organized by Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom and he told them to let's join the Sohrawardi order? Should he not be in the top one then with Nuruddin Nurani? Just a question. Because if we look at the later work, it's also boosted by that event.
That's true. That's true. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned earlier, also the Rishi Silsila comes in, alive with Soharwardis later on. So, for instance, the hagiographers we have of Rishi Silsila, they come from Soharwardis. So we see Khaki, for instance, he writes Rishi Nama. So that's true. I mean, this would
So
be a good reason.
do you want to change
Hmm.
the spots, or do you want to stick with your top five?
No, no, I would still go.
All right, Zubair bhai, what an amazing podcast. I had so much fun and I learned so much today. And I hope everyone who is listening to this also learns a lot. Thank you again. And please follow Zubair on Twitter. His Twitter ID is very weird. I hope he changes to a more easier name to remember. But I will put his links on the description. And he is doing an amazing work on a lot of things. He recently wrote a paper on the whole tradition of the tomb of Jesus in Kashmir, which is a separate podcast we can do some other day. Thank you so much, Zubair and Shakir as well. Shakir, Zubair had all the answers and questions. I don't think we have anything left to say. Thank you, Zubair, again. Hope to
Thank
see you in
you.
touch, and thank
Oh,
you very much again.
thank you. Thank you for having me. Absolutely loved it.
Okay, Shakir and Zubair, take care and Khuda Hawal.